Hello, everyone. As people are still signing on, please let us know where you're tuning in from by writing it in the chat box. My name is Jess Kim, and on behalf of Mustard Seed Generation, I'm so honored to be your moderator this afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar titled An Asian American Conversation on Racism, Integrating Faith, Mental Health, and Civic Engagement. It's quite an ambitious title, but we hope that our time today will be thought-provoking and that it'll help our listeners feel a lot of resonance, as we try to understand racism in the context of all these important areas in our lives. Yesterday marked the second anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. Even though there's been this racial awakening in some sense as a country in the last 2 years, we know that as Asian Americans, participating in these kinds of conversations is still, really new to many of us. And for those who maybe are used to being in these conversations, sometimes it feels performative and exhausting. So even though there's no easy answers to a lot of these questions, we hope that this time today can be a safe space for real talk, right? That can increase both awareness and action, not just as individuals, but also in our communities. So in a few minutes, I'm going to be introducing our esteemed panelists. Then we're going to jump right into our discussion. After our discussion, we're going to have a time of Q&A. So please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A feature below your screen throughout our discussion, and we'll be sure to direct them at the end to our panelists accordingly. If you want to post anonymously, that's fine too. If there's a certain question that resonates with you, just give it a thumbs up, and the most popular questions will be bumped up to the top of the queue. And then we'll end with closing remarks from MSG. So right now, we'd love to learn a little bit more about who's joining us today in the audience. We have a few poll questions ready for you to answer. So here we have our first question. How are you feeling about entering this conversation on racism today? So we'll just take just a few seconds here. If you can just share a little bit about how you're doing. Sadness and anxiety seem to be popular feelings. Anger as well. And okay, just a couple more seconds before we close this poll out. Okay, well, it seems that the majority of us, 60%, are feeling primarily pretty sad, followed closely by anger, anxiety, and feeling conflicted. It's not surprising. We've been gutted with a lot of violence in recent days. So just wanted to get a pulse of the room as we enter this webinar space right now, and just to honor how it is that we're all feeling. Maybe I can just invite all of us right now to maybe collectively take a deep breath and try to exhale any tension in our bodies. Maybe we can just do that together right now. Thank you, everyone, for sharing how you're doing and for making time in the midst of all these feelings to join us today. We can now move to a few more quick poll questions. I am part of a religious community. You could just answer true or false. I acknowledge our audience members from all faith communities, as well as maybe those who are not part of any religious spaces. Okay, it seems that the overwhelming majority is part of a religious community. Okay, and on to the next question. How do you participate in civic engagement? We're curious about how engaged our audience members are with their communities. There's no judgment. We thank you for your honesty. Okay, well, it seems that 75% of us vote, and we have a majority who volunteer. Okay. So thank you. This info about all of you will be helpful, hopefully, to our panelists in framing our conversation today. So I thank everyone for answering these poll questions. And now let's introduce our distinguished panelists. Panelists, please turn on your camera as I introduce each of you. I'm going to start with Dr. Connie Alangovin, who is the founder and a board member of Make Us Visible New Jersey. She's also a child and adolescent adult psychiatrist and a mother. As a psychiatrist, she sees the lifelong impact of racial trauma and the physical and mental toll on children in our communities. And because she's too humble to say this herself, I'm just going to take it upon myself to say that Dr. Langevin successfully led a statewide coalition of over 60 allied organizations and thousands of individuals across the state to advocate for the inclusion of AAPI curricula in K-12 education, making New Jersey the second state in the country to pass this legislation in January of this year. So we're very proud to have her join us today. Next, we have Dr. Russell Jung, who is professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He's an author of books and articles on race and religion. For his research and activism, the Association of Asian American Studies awarded him as Engaged Scholar in 2017. He received the Excellence in Professional Achievement Award from San Francisco State in 2021. And in March 2020, he co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, which tracks incidents of COVID-19 discrimination, to develop policy interventions and long-term solutions to racism. In 2021, he was named as one of the Time 100, Bloomberg 50, and Political 40's most influential people. Thank you, Dr. Jung, for being here. Next, we have Pastor Jin S. Kim, who is founding pastor of Church of All Nations and founder of the Underground Seminary. He attended Georgia Tech, Princeton Seminary, and has a Doctor of Ministry from Columbia Seminary. He's loved serving the local church as a full-time pastor since 1993, and he takes his apostolic calling seriously in sharing the good news of Jesus far and wide. Pastor Jin is passionate about justice, ecumenical unity, and decolonizing the church in favor of village renewal. He and his wife love being with their 2 grown children and their parents. And finally, we have Dr. Jonathan Tran, who's Associate Professor of Religion at Baylor University, where he holds the Baines Chair of Religion. He's author of Vietnam War and Theologies of Memory, Foucault and Theology, and most recently, Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism. He serves as series co-editor for Encountering Religions for Stanford University Press and for the AAR series Reflection in Theory and the Study of Religion for Oxford University Press. He's a principal investigator for a Henry Luce Foundation grant, studying how Asian American religious communities pursue coalitional justice. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us. We know how busy you all are, and so we're so grateful for the service of your time and your expertise for our community this afternoon. My first question is going to be for the entire panel, because you all come from different positionalities, right? So it may be helpful, I think, to start by sharing just a little bit about who you are more personally, right? So our audience has a better sense of how it is that you show up in this space. So could each of you just share a little bit about your migration story and your lived experiences that have helped shape your consciousness today, right, about race and racism? So let's start with Dr. Langevin, and then the rest of the panel can feel free to jump in after her.
Thanks, Jess. And I'm very grateful to Jess. She's too modest to stay, but she hosted a rally that was very important to getting our bill passed. So thank you so much, Jess. I was born in Chicago. My parents immigrated from Tamil Nadu in southern India to Chicago in the 70s to do their medical residencies there. They were pioneers in their family and brought nearly all their siblings here. And I became an activist, not because I'm strong, but because I'm wounded. And my wound would not allow me to rest, and it pushed me outside of my comfort zone into action. My wound was with me for as long as I can remember. We moved into a nearly all-white neighborhood in which there was only one other Asian American family, and some of our neighbors were unhappy that we'd moved there and harassed us. When drawing myself, I would use a peach or light tan crayon. I was afraid to highlight my difference by using my real color. Anyway, my real color wasn't even in the box. I remember being proud of my younger brother when he used a dark brown crayon to draw our family. And I was glad that he didn't share my shame. When I would write stories, they would be about white people and the characters all had white names. It did not occur to me to write about someone like me with a name like mine. And as a mother, I brought my children to a school district where 70% of the kids are Asian American and many of the kids are brown. I didn't want them to have to go through what I did. And I was heartbroken on back to school night to see that many of the kids with Indian names still chose to color themselves with the peach crayon, even though they were surrounded by kids who looked like them. I feel that it's because our curriculum is not diverse enough. and doesn't show people of different backgrounds, and they don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. I feel our wounds have value and can guide us. And as Leonard Cohen says, ring the bells that can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. In The Wounded Healer, Henry Nguyen writes, the main question is not how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed, but how can we put our woundedness in service of others? And when our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we've become wounded healers. And my wound has been guiding me, and it's led me to plant seeds for a future in which all lives are valued, no matter what they look like or whom they love. And I'm working for a safer, loving, and more connected world. And I'm grateful that the bill passed so that our children can see themselves reflected in their curriculum.
Anyone, please feel free to jump in.
Well, thanks, Dr. Connie, for that amazing intro. And I have to shout out both Jess and Connie for their efforts to pass ethnic studies and Asian American studies in New Jersey. It's a remarkable story that because of their persistence and advocacy, they were really able to make long-term institutional change. So thanks, Mustard Seed, for inviting us. I'm Dr. Russell Jung. I'm actually a fifth generation Chinese American. And so every historical incidence of racism against Asian Americans, I think my family has experienced. We faced mass dispossession and displacement, exclusion, segregation, quarantine, detention, deportation, and long-term family separation because we were Chinese. And so, like Dr. Connie said, I think there's been a lot of intergenerational trauma in my family. It's clear that we've faced exclusion. And so in periods when we feel unheard, I see my father get upset and angry, and I know that I respond similarly. So like Dr. Connie said, I don't mind sharing my woundedness because hopefully God's grace is sufficient in our weaknesses and his power is shown. And so I just am excited to be here with everybody and really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers as well.
Hey, everybody. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really excited about this. I'm excited about two things or two and a half things for today. One, I'm really excited to be on this panel and thankful for the organizers and leaders. I'm really excited to see the Top Gun sequel, which I'm really, I do after today, and something happy or maybe sort of happy in a pretty sad week. And I'm happy for my daughter graduating from high school, and graduation is later this week. So I'll share three brief migration stories. One, the migration of our family from the north part of Vietnam to the south part as the communists fought kind of against colonization. So our family was in the midst of that. And you can imagine all the kinds of dispossession, as Russell talked about, that happens for a family in something like that. The second was the migration as war refugees to America in the mid-1970s. And the kind of perpetual dispossession that one goes through. And I would talk about a third migration, and maybe we can return to this later on. And I think this contributes to lots of, or at least some parts of the mental health struggle for a lot of us Asian American folks, is the migration into a kind of anti-race discourse that doesn't really know what to do with us. And that involves its own kind of dispossession. And so these three migrations, let's say the first two I've been readily willing to talk about. The third one is one I think we all suffer from, but we often don't know how to give voice to it. And that voicelessness is part of the dispossession. My hope is that we're learning maybe from each other, if nowhere else, ways to give voice to that. So again, I'm glad to be here with you all.
Jen, would you like to say something?
Yes, apologies to everyone. I'm at a coffee shop. I'm grateful for Jess for inviting me on this panel and our relationship since I was a youth pastor many years ago, and for this distinguished panel that I have the privilege of being a part of. Today was really interesting because my son Austin, or Intron, just sent me a picture of, he's a senior at the University of Minnesota, of there's a record of his grandfather, so my wife's father, as a student at the University of Minnesota in 1956, and he was one of the founding students of Korean Student Association. And Austin is treasurer of KSA now, and turns out his grandfather was a founding treasurer of KSA back in 1956. So that was kind of an exciting discovery today to have that heritage. Um, my family moved in 1975 when I was 7 years old, and we first landed in LAX, our Ellis Island for a lot of AAPI people. But my aunt was a professor at the University of South Carolina. So a few months later, we ended up going to Columbia, South Carolina, where she was on Halloween. So it was a really frightening experience. And my first Halloween in a whole new place in the deep South, the first day to secede from the Union over slavery. But I grew up there in the midst of white and black people. Most of my elementary, middle, high school years, I was one of the very few minorities. In fact, throughout my elementary years, the schools were required to do racial statistics. And I remember the teacher would ask how many whites, and then how many blacks, and then how many others. So I was the other. I thought my home country's name was Other for a long. That's a joke. Okay. Um, that's how little diversity there was. It was a very binary world, and people like me were expected to be co-opted into one of those communities. Um, and what I learned growing up is that the the jobless, the poor employment and educational structures, the low wage jobs, and all of that uh, is worse the darker skinned you are. So not through explicit teaching, but just really by breathing the air of the society and the striving of Asian American immigrant communities, the Korean church I grew up in, the message we got was try to be as white as possible. Move in the direction of white education, white jobs, white neighborhoods, white elitism, and that's the American dream. Was never explicitly stated like that, but we basically imbibed that kind of internalized racism very deeply. And so I was a student at Princeton Seminary when the Rodney King incident happened, where white police officers did incredible police brutality on a black motorist. And next thing you know, Korean businesses were being burned to the ground in South Central LA. And it took me a while to try to understand what that was, but I know that the internalized racism of Korean people and the ways that we have chased after white privilege at the expense of our own humanity and solidarity with others who were actually being oppressed was one part of that. It's not the only part of that story. The language part. And so in 2004, we launched Church Foundations, an intentional multicultural church to directly address what some of us consider the original sin of America, which is racism, to as a church community to address that which hurts and divides us and try to do something that is actually something for the common good for all of humanity. So my own background of marginalization, and then seeing how unaddressed has devastating impact in regular people's lives. As long as 30 years ago, I mean, that was this year's the 30th anniversary of the Rodney King incident is a part of what shapes me today. And of course, I live in Minneapolis, just a few miles from the George Floyd incident that happened now. This is a 2-year anniversary of that. So Minneapolis, St. Paul is really in many ways a ground zero of police brutality and the way that white supremacy shows up in our society. So for all those reasons, I'm very humbled to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you to each of you for sharing these personal reflections. I mean, it really highlights how our views on race are really shaped by a lifetime, of experiences, both direct and indirect in our families and in our neighborhoods. My next question is about racism. A lot of people tend to understand racism as an individual level problem, right? Where someone intentionally directs hate towards somebody else based on their race. But each of you has worked towards confronting the structural, the systemic, and institutional realities of racism. So I'd like to ask each of you about this. Jonathan, I'll start with you. In your book, Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, you say, right, that this assumption of racism as primarily an individual level phenomenon is misplaced, and that in fact, it's the inverse, right? You say it's always systemic and sometimes individual. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, it's misplaced, it's overly convenient. It puts us in positions of oftentimes participating and perpetuating the systemic realities because we think they're only individual realities. So largely what I try to ask people is to think about this question: why does racism persist? And I try to argue in the book that racism persists because it works. And how does it work? It facilitates a society of extraordinary domination, oppression, inequality, and justice. And what racism does is give all of that a veneer of respectability by blaming those who suffer the oppressions, the domination, the exploitations, by laying it on their race. And so it makes use of a kind of fiction about identity to justify domination. And so it's always structural and systemic in this way. I think for Asian Americans, how this plays out, especially on issues like mental health, are questions of what it means to live in a society or set of systems and structures and institutions where there's constant forms of oppression and domination laid on our heads. And we're supposed to participate in these kinds of ways. So we might think of, say, the model minority myth is not an accident of our history. It's necessary. It's created to hide the ways in which we're kind of laid under the pressures of these realities. It's also the case that Asian Americans, in some parts of the AAPI history, we've significantly participated in these realities. And that's also often taken away from views that we don't focus on them. We always think the racist is somewhere out there. It's not us. It's not our school systems that we're choosing to participate in, or our way of, say, hoarding access to healthcare, education. The other thing I think that this plays out, if we think about largely the structural systemic realities, what I describe in the book as racial capitalism, it also misses the way that this system pits us against other people of color. And this goes to what I described earlier as migrating into an anti-racism that's not only doesn't know quite what to do with us, but further marginalizes us. In the language of the video presentation at the beginning, it simply doesn't count us. And so we suffer both the reality of racism, that marginalization, and then a second marginalization when people tell us, you don't really suffer racism, you don't really count in this story. And to suggest that we do is often to pit us against others whose stories obviously count, and I think should count. And we cannot underestimate the extraordinary toll this plays on the human soul, not simply the suffering of these oppressions, but the marginalization by pitting us against other people of color. That to give voice to our own suffering somehow is suggested as taking away from the suffering of others. And this type of toll on the human soul, again, we cannot underappreciate in terms of its power.
Thank you. Jen, you founded the Underground Seminary, you say, to decolonize Christian leadership. Could you maybe briefly describe just a couple of fundamental principles that you teach your seminarians about racism?
I'm trying to shield the background noise. We used to have a pretty robust internship program where we would take graduates from conventional seminaries from all over the country, and it took really so long to deprogram our interns from the conventional expectations of ordained ministry and the kind of ecclesiastical elitism that they had been trained to seek after, and also really profound ignorance on how race and racism in this country shapes us. That I felt like we had to create something from scratch that got us to really look at our racialized location, but also how things were, how our ancestors used to live when they had a culture and not saw themselves through the tremendously distorted lens of race. So we basically only know how to do either ministry through our conventional racialized locations, um, or we either participate in the larger racialized movement, or we end up in racial ghettos. And I just don't see how we're going to make progress as a commonwealth where we contribute to each other's well-being if we can't break through our isolation, the way that communities are siloed. And that means we have to go deeper into our own ethnocultural backgrounds until we hit the bedrock of our own humanity. I mean, we can share food and dress and some cultural greetings and things like that. And that's one way to be a multicultural community. But the other way is to understand ourselves and find our own humanity so deeply in our own traditions, the best we can locate it, that when we hit the bedrock of our humanity, we connect to the bedrock of others. And in that way, not just a solidarity of grievances, but a solidarity of what makes us human in the most basic way. And that can't happen unless people come together and start to really live and worship and play together. And that's part of why we created church foundations, but also underground seminaries, so that we can form leaders who are capable of that kind of the cultivation of that kind of genuinely multicultural community. And a lot of multicultural communities out there actually deny the racism out there. It's like a kind of a colorblind approach. But I think that is facile, shallow, and it's not going to have legs, because the reality is that even though race as as an idea is hollow and it's really nothing, it doesn't actually, it's not real. But nevertheless, racism, the impact of people's belief in race is very real. So some people conflate those two concepts, that yes, race is a false construct, but nevertheless, it has real impact because there is sociological and political power behind it. And because of that, future pastors and future religious leaders really need to understand how race shapes us and distorts us and perverts our faith, and really unpacking that is part of the rationale for forming Underground Seminary.
Thank you. Russell, you co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, which has tracked about 11,000 anti-Asian hate incidents across the country since the start of the pandemic. And even though these are individual attacks, what do you think these one-on-one incidents show us about the collective and the historical legacy of anti-Asian xenophobia?
Yeah, that's a great question. The 11,000 cases are just a fraction of what's happening. We found in our surveys that 1 out of 5 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced racism in the last year, right? That's 4 million cases of hate. So these 4 million cases aren't all perpetrated by a few prejudiced individuals. There's something else if we go upstream, realizing there's something socializing so many people to become hateful. People are learning racism and then perpetrating racism on an individual level. So that's why we have to, instead of trying to train and address or maybe punish each individual, we have to go upstream to see what's the source of the problem that's causing all these people to cough and spit, harass and push and shove Asians. Why do we have a society and a culture that's so hateful, so self-interested that we can't even wear masks, that we don't worry about, sorry, I'm getting political, worry about gun safety? So, like Jonathan said, and what Pastor Jin talked about, is that institutions socialize us and train us to be racist because it benefits certain people. Racism works. And that's why politicians use scapegoating to mask their problems, to blame COVID-19 on a certain group, right? And the term Chinese virus, people were afraid of COVID naturally, but then it gets socially constructed that the virus is Chinese with that term Chinese virus, that the virus, the biological virus, becomes racialized and it becomes a Chinese virus. That association that the virus is Chinese, that racialization of the virus really was manipulated by politicians because they wanted to rile their base, to blame China and to scapegoat outsiders. It works, and so they do it. It's the yellow peril stereotype that's been used again and again because it works. So that's why Jonathan and the rest of us are saying this racism is structural, because it's produced by institutions who are maintained, both the institutions and those running the institutions benefit from it. And so we at Stop AAPI Hate have 11,000 individual cases, but they all point to the pervasiveness and the structuring, the creation, the social blaming of Asians for COVID-19, leading to mass racism. So if we want to go upstream, we have to recognize the source of the problem, and then we have to address systemic racism. We have to get to the roots of racism and dismantle them or uproot them, rather than trying to work one-on-one with everybody who's maybe individually prejudiced. And again, like Jonathan said, we Asians are complicit in this system. We too can become racist as we grow up in this system. So we have to admit we could be anti-white, we could be anti-Black, we could internalize racism and shun the Asian parts of us. So we're all part of the system, and so we need to change the system that socializes us to be racist. I hope that's understandable for most people. That's why we're working on policies.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarity. And Connie, you founded Make Us Visible New Jersey and led the enormous coalition which made legislation of AAPI curriculum the law in New Jersey. Can you help our listeners understand how educational institutions have anything to do with racism?
Yeah, I really believe education is the antidote to hate. And that's why I feel it's so important to focus on this. And children pay attention to whose stories are told in school and whose stories aren't. And it shows how valued you are. And we want our kids to know that we're valued and that we do contribute and we belong. And not only our kids, we want their classmates to know that. Because as Asian Americans, no longer matter how long we've been here, we're often seen as perpetual foreigners. I want, we're invisible in the curriculum, and the windows and mirrors is a concept in education that we use to advocate for inclusive curriculum. And, we learn about the world through looking through windows, right? And we learn about other people, we learn about what's going on inside. But if we're always looking through the same window with the same people on the other side, seeing the same stories play out over and over, you begin to believe that's how big the world is. That's why I was only writing stories about white people, because I was only learning about white people. I was asking my kids what they learn in American history, and they keep hearing about the Revolutionary War again and again and again. We have a really rich American history, and it's not being represented. So in school, students learn from their curriculum and form their worldviews from what they're taught. And if kids are shown the same windows over and over again, they may not even conceive to ask, is there another window? And mirrors are reflections of ourselves. When we watch movies or shows or read books, we're often drawn to characters we resonate with because we see ourselves in them, or our stories in theirs. And mirrors give us a place and sense of belonging. And when we see that, our law requires that our stories are included, it'll give us a sense that we belong and tells the world that we belong too. And in any space where we find ourselves learning about other people or ourselves, there should be a healthy balance between these two. Windows offer us an opportunity to learn about other people's stories and foster empathy, and mirrors empower us and place us in a larger context where we can declare to the world we belong. So, I really hope we can teach complete US history, and the way we learn about the past will shape the way we build about our future. For example, many people don't know that we have birthright citizenship due to Wang Kim Ark, and he was a Chinese American man and was going to be kicked out of the country due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. But he fought it all the way to the Supreme Court and won birthright citizenship for all of us because he was born here. And because of him, millions of people have birthright citizenships. But most people don't know that. Most people don't know that ESL was due to the fight of Asian Americans to be included in education. Most people don't know that Title VII and Title IX, the reasons why girls can play sports in schools, are from Patsy Mink. And most people don't know Same-Sex Marriage Act was from, the first case was from an Asian American and Pacific Islander couple. You know, I think that children would benefit from learning this history.
Thank you. Thank you for those powerful metaphors. Thank you, panelists, for speaking to the larger collective structural realities of racism. My next question is for Dr. Tran and Pastor Kim. The intersection of race, class, and religion is something that you both understand very well. Jonathan, your book, Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, challenges Asian Americans, particularly Asian American Christians, to take steps towards dispossession of our participation in racial capitalism. So for our audience members who are not political economists, theologians, or academics, can you say more about what that means of not participating in racial capitalism?
If the audience people are not political theologians, political economists, academics, that just means they're more humane. So that's a good place to start. Yeah, one of the things I tried to remind us is that one of the most pernicious effects of the model minority myth, the idea that all Asian Americans succeed, that myth, is not simply that it's grossly inaccurate or that it pits people against each other. But one of the most pernicious effects is that it seems to be an alluring script for a lot of Asian Americans, that that's what they're supposed to be. To be Asian Americans means to go to the top high school and therefore to go to the top university. And the problem within a political economy or a society that's built on exploitation that comes downstream from centuries of inequality is that you can't get ahead without participating and perpetuating that injustice. And so participating in the model minority myth, say, getting to the upper ranks of society, cannot be done in our society without perpetuating those realities. And so to participate in the myth, to live out its script, say, to live up to its expectations, is in some ways to participate, well, in direct ways to participate in the discrimination and exploitation and oppression of other people. And so I try to ask us then, what alternative scripts do we have? And here I lean into a theological story about Jesus, right? So Jesus is fully God, but Jesus is also fully creature, fully human. And so what he articulates, what his life shows, is what it means to be fully human, fully alive. And Jesus' life, like a number of the lives of my panelists, certainly not me, but some of my panelists, is lives of dispossession, that they've decided that the best form of moral agency that they can imagine is the form of moral agency that Jesus exemplified, which was giving up, dispossessing. And that in that they found radical accounts of joy, the greatest forms of life. And this runs against a capitalist economy that says that the best way to be human is to exploit others, and to exploit others gets you to the top. Well, what Pastor Jen and Russell have done with their lives, what Dr. Connie has done with her activism, is articulate a form of life that says maybe the most powerful form of human agency is one that dispossesses itself, so that it can be found in the language of Philippians 2 on the right side of the kingdom, on the right side of history. In time, it will often feel like it's just dispossession. But I think, our friends here could probably attest, they find actually pretty amazing forms of joy in giving of themselves in these ways. That's just the basic grammar of Christian discipleship, and something that I think provides an amazing resource for us in the face of extraordinary forms of racism.
I imagine some of us are probably uncomfortable hearing these hard truths, and I think that that's probably a good thing. Jen, your church seems to embody much of this vision that Dr. Tran suggests in his book, Church of All Nations models something that you have called village renewal. So can you describe like what that means and what it looks like practically so that other faith communities might consider taking similar steps?
Yes, thanks for that prompt. And I just want to say, as a fellow Christian, to what Dr. Jonathan just said, amen. So beautifully articulated. Thank you for that. It's really inspiring. And it's such a treat to be here and just sit at the feet of my fellow panelists. I'm truly humbled by the example that you set and the life that you live. I go back to when Jesus encountered a demon-possessed man and asked what his name was, he identified him as Legion. And Legion just meant the military unit of the Roman Empire that was occupying Palestine. So they had the Roman Empire illegally occupying their land. So empires also have spirit. The spirit of empire or the logic of empire is the same. It's basically the exploitation of the many for the benefit of an elite few, but it shows up differently in different succeeding empires. The strategy of empire is always divide and conquer, and how the United States, the American empire, had used that is particularly through the method of race, is to divide us. So instead of like even poor versus rich, or categories, class, gender, it's really used race as the primary strategy to divide and conquer, which is why poor, oppressed white people will nevertheless vote with their elite white masters to form a bloc against the interests of really everyone. And this actually, we just completed units 5 and 6 in our seminary in the last 4 weeks, where I very much pressed our students to understand the history of capitalism. I just want to make a distinction that there's always been markets. So people exchanging or with the advent of money, buying and selling goods and services. So that's an age-old tradition in most cultures around the world. I'm very much actually pro-market. But what I've come to be against is capitalism. Capitalism is buying and is using money to use commodities to make more money. So the point of a regular market is to distribute resources in a way that benefits all. But the purpose of capitalism is for those who control the means of production and an inordinate amount of land, usually ill-gotten, to leverage their assets to make more money, endlessly more money. So where we are right now is what economists and historians call late-stage neoliberal capitalism. That just means that we have exploited people and the earth, the environment, with such devastating effect that we're basically facing not only the collapse of human societies, but possibly human extinction for the first time in our history. That's the level of exploitation that we've come to. And part of being, part of living the American dream is actually buying into capitalism as what it means to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That whole project is profoundly bankrupt, and in my opinion, contrary to human nature itself. So this is why we are at the brink of human extinction, because we're pursuing a path that is just simply not sustainable, not for the environment, not for a peace among human beings to live in harmony with one another. So I am Christian, I do follow Jesus, but in my opinion, my allies, my co-spiritualists are people who care about one another. And as our indigenous sisters and brothers here in North America or on Turtle Island say, caring about what happens in the 7th generation. So whether someone is Buddhist or Taoist or Muslim, anyone who believes in God and through that understands that it's our collective humanity that we are here to advocate for, those are my sisters and brothers. And that's what we teach here in Church Formations. I mean, we are a Presbyterian church, actually, PCUSA, mainline. But that's actually what we believe, that Jesus leads us to solidarity with all humanity. Capitalism in the formal sense is only about 400 years old. In 1602, the first bourse was created in Amsterdam to trade various portions of the Dutch East India Company. So, and the biggest bourse today is the New York Stock Exchange. But, and then it was designed to promote just the buying and selling of British East and West India companies, the Dutch East and West India companies, in order to colonize the world. So capitalism as we have today is rooted in slavery and colonialism, in exploitation and brutality. We need to return to the kind of robust and natural and organic markets that our ancestors had for thousands of years. But this perversion called capitalism, and in our day, late stage capitalism really must be abolished if there's going to be any hope for humanity and the planet.
Okay, thank you. I think I need to take a class to hear more about that. This is fascinating. And I know that you probably have a lot more to say about that, Jen. My next question is going to be for Dr. Langevin and Dr. Jung. You're both community organizers and activists for racial justice. And I think when most people hear that, they assume that these roles are for a certain type of person, right? Someone who is radical or confrontational. Certainly not them. Right. So, Connie, for our listeners who don't see themselves as activists, what would you say to them?
I would say, I would suggest joining a community, and for me, that was the Central New Jersey Asian American Reading Group. And that community was not planning any political gains. We were reading stories together, and we watched the Asian American PBS series, and we had different discussions. And for me, it really enriched my sense of identity to learn this history and sense of belonging, to know how AAPI helped build this country. And, through that group, when anti-Asian hate started rising, I wrote to the members to see if anyone wanted to work with me to pass AAPI curriculum in New Jersey, and 5 people responded. And, in a community, you find collective power together. And the larger the coalition, the larger our reach and power. We wrote an open letter, and then, 1,500 people signed that letter. And that gave us a broad cross-section of different ethnic communities and geographical regions in New Jersey. And I'm so grateful to be working with Jess. She's brilliant and amazing and very well-connected and awesome. I'm grateful to be working with a team of amazing, talented, intelligent, dedicated women. And collectively, we accomplished more than any of us could do alone. Mainly, I think to remember, you don't have to do it alone, and try to find people who are like-minded. And any idea or project each of us had was made better and richer by the collective efforts of the group. And together, we mobilized our communities and created cultural events, rallies, and opportunities for collective action. Just building community is an activist act, because so many people are alone and isolated and don't feel agency. But building community, it gives people a sense of identity and belonging and joy. And, together we called and wrote and met with our legislators to communicate the urgency of the bills. And this unity and connections are deep and strong and are going to get us to the more important phase of implementation. And I wanted to let you all know that I knew nothing about passing legislation before this. And, we just kind of flew by the seat of our pants, learned something new every day. We're very flexible and agile with the circumstances. And we were like water. If there was an obstacle, we would find another path and just keep going. We were going to do this for our kids, no matter what was going to happen, and you don't have to pass a bill to advocate for inclusion of Asian American stories in your school. You can talk to your school administrators, your teachers. You can volunteer to read AA stories in your kids' classrooms. I'm really proud in my child's school today, they had an AAPI read-in, which one of our board members, Seema Kumar, helped lead last year. So just getting our stories out there, that's a beautiful act and much needed.
Thank you. Russell, can you help our audience understand why you see civic engagement and your faith as being so closely connected that you can't compartmentalize them?
Sure. I think we know faith without works is dead. We know that we're supposed to love our neighbor. We know we're supposed to do justice and walk humbly and love mercy. And so for me, if you want to live out your faith, it's going to be in a outward, there's going to be outward expressions of it. And like Dr. Connie was talking about, we're not just individuals, we're always part of the collective, whether we see ourselves as part of the community or not. And so what we do clearly impacts others around us. And like Dr. Jonathan says, what we do makes us complicit with the oppression and exploitation of others around us. So if we understand our interconnectedness, if we understand how intertwined we are, then civic engagement just becomes a natural, but it's not, nothing's natural, a constructed, disciplined way to worship God. So civic engagement is my act of worship. Civic engagement is the way I pray and seek God to do justice. Civic engagement is my way to find community, like Dr. Connie was just talking about. It's the way we journey and pilgrim towards the kingdom of heaven, to make heaven come down, or to make earth as it is in heaven. So I don't see how you cannot live out your faith without civic engagement. Sorry, I don't see how you can worship without civic engagement. I don't see how you could, I don't know. Because if you don't consciously do that, you are being civically disengaged and not living out your faith. So just think of the opposite. If you're not engaged, then how are you complicit with a system that leads to the shootings of children? How are you complicit with a system that's leading to climate change, right? And so unless we are engaged, we're part of a system that's leading towards the destruction of our society, destruction of humanity, destruction of our world. So we have to get engaged.
You're muted, Jess.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that I hope our listeners feel inspired by these convictions that you are sharing. And as we're coming near the end of our discussion, just have a couple of quick questions before we shift quickly to Q&A. It's the case that for so long, many Asian Americans have felt invisible, as we have said, right, in our national discourse on racism, where it's historically been a very black and white binary conversation. And we've been dealing with so much racialized trauma, during the last 2 years, especially with rising hate against our community. So Connie, I was wondering if you could just speak about the collective impact this has had on the mental health of the AAPI community.
Yeah, it's impacting the quality of our lives and our relationships and robbing our kids of their childhood. The AAPI individuals are reporting increased distress, anxiety, and depression. As I mentioned earlier from Dr. Jung's wonderful statistics, 1 in 3 AAPI parents report their child experienced a hate incident in school this past year. And our kids are kids only once, and we want to protect them. And as a psychiatrist, I see these acts of hatred take an enormous toll physically and mentally on our children and communities. I saw the consequences of racial trauma in them, and they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel like there was a safe place for them. They didn't feel like they belonged. They felt like something was wrong with them. They felt like they should be other than what they are, look different than they are, live different than how they do. I hear from my patients about the fear that overtakes them, the nightmare that robs them of their energy, the hypervigilance that saps their playfulness, the emotional numbing that diminishes their experience of the world. It changes your way of being. If you're traumatized, you are hypervigilant for a future in which you're harmed, or caught up in a past where you were harmed. And it affects your basic sense of being in the world, and it damages your ability to form relationships. So that's why I feel it's so urgent for us to try to do this now and try to get AAPI history taught in schools now, to try to interrupt this cycle of racism, because I do think education is our best bet in trying to deal with this racism. So thanks.
Thank you. And as Asians are the fastest growing racial group in the country, as we know, the need for healing is more urgent now than ever before, as you said. And I want to direct this last question just to one more response from any of you, just because we are pressed for time. And it's a big question. But what do you believe we can start doing as a community to bring healing and reconciliation across racial lines?
I'm beginning to think that this is the forward edge of our work, that the one work we're doing is legislative and institutional, this kind of work. But I feel like we're perpetually running into the wall of people who cannot believe that Asians count when it comes to racism. I mean, Russell and his group should be given something like the Nobel Peace Prize for the work they've done in moving the needle and getting us to count. I mean, after what happened in Buffalo, it was a small miracle, and I attribute some of that to Russell's work, that what happened in Laguna Woods was included in the broader narrative. That would not have happened a year ago for 100 years in American history, right? And so, but there still seems to be a block. This is a way to segue actually to the questions. What do you do when someone doesn't believe Asian Americans experience racism? My answer is I'm not sure what to do, to be honest. Russell and I were on a panel just a few weeks ago. We were actually celebrating, Dr. Connie, the legislative act in New Jersey. And we were celebrating the fact that Asian American history will be taught in New Jersey public schools. And someone in really an honest, good faith question said, well, why should we celebrate Asian Americans' history being told when American history isn't even being told? Right? You get the force of the question, and it's a good faith question. The difficulty for us Asian Americans is that we cannot ignore the reality of what white people have done to Black people. That is seeped into the soil of this country. But we will be tempted to. We will be tempted to essentialize race all over again, because we'll be operating out of a zero-sum deficit situation where we feel like our story is never told. And the only available script for us is to try to hog the show in terms of how to tell the story of Asian Americans. And we will become competitive in our logics against other oppressed people. I cannot emphasize how deadly of a temptation that is in this moment, especially with the perpetual forms of violence against Asian Americans. And I'm not sure the answer here. I'm not sure how we're going to make our way clear. Maybe we return to our history and remember that what Asian America first named was a multiracial, internationalist, coalitional politics. It wasn't the attempt to claim an essential racial identity. It was to say that to look at the world of race through Asian Americans illumines not simply something about the history of Asian Americans, it illumines the history of race. And to do so offers a genuine contribution to the conversation. We need to both claim that contribution without claiming it in a way that then tries to get into a zero-sum logic with other people. This is going to be very hard to do.
Thank you, Jonathan, that response to such an incredibly big question. At this point, we have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to direct questions that have come from our audience. There was a question about good books or materials, but we're not going to answer that now because we're just going to send those resources to the audience after the webinar instead of taking time now to talk about that. So I'll just jump to this question of, at an individual level, how can people grow as witnesses against racism? Because it can be discouraging to hear racism as systemic. Despite its truth, it can feel disempowering just as one person. So at an individual level, how can people grow as witnesses against racism? Anyone want to take that?
I encourage you to join an anti-racism group and work with like-minded people who care about racism. And really, I think racism is too hard to fight on your own, and you're going to get burnt out and be bitter. And I think you need other people to keep you grounded. And, I really encourage you to find community who cares about this And I just wanted to share this beautiful metaphor. It's a fire triangle. To have a fire, you need three things. You need heat. Heat is like your dissatisfaction with how things are. You need fuel, and fuel is like taking care of yourself, giving yourself care so that you can keep going. And you need oxygen. And oxygen is the air you breathe. It's the way you see the world. It's your inspiration. So for many of you, it's your spirituality. And those of you who are secular, hopefully it's like the beauty and joy you see in the universe, or I don't know, whatever gives you that sense. But that was from Reverend Deborah Ford, who was an African-American civil rights activist and an LGBTQ activist. And that's how she's maintained her activism for decades. You know, so I just encourage you to take comfort in community.
Thank you.
Jess, can I address that?
Sure. Yes, please.
Yes. I think if we just do activism without community, like Dr. Connie just said, it is likely to burn us out. When we're engaged in genuine community where we care about one another, and it is a diverse community, then just caring about our neighbor, caring about our friend, our sister, brother, makes us care about their background and the structural forces that press down on whoever we may be. So caring about one person is really in my opinion, one of the most enduring ways of entering into the work of justice. And when we're really in a loving relationship with another human being or community, we don't get tired of that. But issues, we can get tired of. Policies, we can experience politics fatigue. But people genuinely have the capacity to love another human being and love a community of a lifetime. So, along with some of the panelists, I strongly encourage people to help construct one. And in order to train people for constructing that kind of community wherever people are is one reason we created Underground Seminary. If anyone wants to have an experience of what that kind of training looks like, please feel free to look us up at undergroundsem.org.
Thank you both for that. I mean, I can personally attest to how discouraging and depleting it can feel like when you're not surrounding yourself with people who understand what it is that you care about and why. So that is really, really important. There's a question here that I want to ask from the audience. How do you start a conversation with someone who believes Asian hate isn't real? And we sort of touched on this indirectly, but how do you start a conversation with someone who believes Asian hate isn't real, including Asian Americans?
Russell has helped us a lot with his statistics. So thank you, Russell, for making Asian hate visible.
Absolutely.
It's been, and data disaggregation really helps because they think, oh, Asian Americans are rich, we have no problems, you know, so data disaggregation really helps.
Okay, well, why don't we move on then? How do you, the panelists, protect your own mental health and your own well-being while working with topics that are so overwhelming like this?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go, this goes back to something several of you said. I think you need to imagine yourself part of a story that's bigger than the oppressions that we are suffering. And so think about something like Mustard Seed Generation. What does it do? It works with people in the challenges in mental health. And what they come to realize that these challenges are structured into our society. So they get an increasingly wide and simultaneously intimate view of the damage racism is doing. And so their world is their recognition is the world is increasingly grim. But the whole idea of a mustard seed in the parable in scripture is that you're part of something growing where you're not in charge of growing it. And that does an amazing amount of work. And you can get this, that's certainly from Jesus's parable, but you can get this from Islam, certainly get it within Judaism. you certainly get it in certain left stories of Marxism. These are ways of imagining, trying to find light when light is incredibly difficult to find. And so I didn't grow up Christian, and I get it. Christianity is complicit in extraordinary ways in American racism. You can imagine an unholy trinity between America, racism, and Christianity. But I still think Christianity is the best thing since sliced bread, at least in terms of what I found, because it implots me within a story that isn't of my making, that helps me see the world honestly, but without that honesty crushing me, because I think it would. And so what I find with people who do the kind of work all the great people, not me, on this panel do, and what they are able to, why they're able to do it for generations, is they imagine themselves, as Dr. Connie said, part of communities who are part of stories, who imagine themselves something like a mustard seed conspiracy, something growing where they're not responsible for its growing.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. We are coming to the end of our program, and I just want to give all of our panelists a chance. If you have anything that you just want to add at the end, please feel free to do so now. And if not, that's okay too. Okay, well, the time has gone by way too quickly. There was a lot to pack in, and I wish we really could have stayed, on a lot of these questions. But thank you. Before I hand the mic off to Sharon Kim, I'd like to thank all our panelists once again, for sharing your personal reflections and your insights with all of us today. I mean, what a gift this has been for our greater community. And for our audience members, I truly hope that we've all learned something today, that this brief but rich discussion will just be a catalyst to, continue more thought and action in your own personal circles moving forward. And for our parting words, please allow me now to introduce Sharon Kim, the Executive Director of Mustard Seed Generation, who works tirelessly behind the scenes to generate programs like today. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, panelists, speakers, for the insightful conversation. It was such a fantastic panel. Thank you, Jessica, for moderating the panel so beautifully and eloquently. As the audience, I think we all needed the space to learn, process, and heal together. So thank you so much for doing that. Now I'd like to turn to the audience. We originally scheduled this time to be an ask for support for Mustard Seed Generation's work. However, because of the tragic massacre at Uvalde, Texas, just 2 days ago, we scrapped all our plans, and we are now doing a call for action. And so we are fundraising $2,000 to support families of Robb Elementary School. Our panelists today mentioned that we need to stand together, that we need to take collective action. And I, as a member of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, I want to not just act on behalf of myself and my children in the future, but also I want to also challenge us to stand together with our brothers and sisters who are hurting and grieving for the loss of their child, their teacher, their classmate, and neighbor as well. So please join me in showing your love, encouragement, and support for the Uvalde community. All proceeds today that are raised today will go to that community, and you can use the QR code that's shown on the screen right now, or we just dropped the fundraising campaign link into the chat box. So please join us in supporting and showing our love to them. And if you feel compelled to give to Mustard Seed Generation, you can also visit our merch store where we sell items created by Asian American designers. You can use the merch as conversation starters with families and friends. So we'll drop that link as well into the chat box if you are interested in purchasing and starting that in your own community. So thank you so much for joining us in this critical conversation on race and racism. I hope this was helpful. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.